Are those things even hands, old-timer? Or just a couple of rusty tools you forgot to put away? The voice, sharp with the arrogant confidence of youth, cut through the low hum of the base motor pool. Private First Class Miller leaned against the frame of a Humvee, a smirk plastered on his face. His two friends, Jones and Davis, snickered behind him, their postures a lazy mirror of their leaders. The old man they were addressing didn't flinch. Arthur Peterson, his back to them, continued to methodically tighten a bolt deep within the vehicle's engine bay. His hands, the subject of their ridicule, were a roadmap of a long life. The knuckles were swollen, the skin cross-hatched with 1,000 tiny scars, silver against the weathered bronze of his skin. Grease was permanently etched into the lines of his palms, a testament to decades spent coaxing life back into stubborn machines. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that the young soldiers mistook for frailty. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Pop," Miller pressed, his voice louder now. The sergeant said this vehicle needed a diagnostic. He didn't say anything about calling in an exhibit from the Natural History Museum. More laughter. A few other soldiers and civilian mechanics nearby paused their work, their eyes darting nervously between the belligerent privates and the silent old man. It was an uncomfortable spectacle, like watching someone tease a sleeping lion. Most of them knew Arthur, or at least knew of him. He was a fixture in the motor pool, a quiet man who kept to himself and possessed an almost magical ability to diagnose an engine's ailment just by listening to it idle. He was reliable, he was kind, and he was currently the target of 3 bored soldiers looking to feel big. Arthur finished with the bolt and slowly withdrew his hand. He picked up a clean rag and began wiping the grease from his fingers, each movement precise and unhurried. He turned, his gaze not defiant or angry but placid, like the surface of a deep lake. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they seemed to look straight through the young men standing before him. "Engine's running rough," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble weathered like an old leather belt. "Cylinder 4 has a misfire, needs a new ignition coil." Miller scoffed, taking a step closer. He was taller than Arthur, broader in the shoulders, his uniform crisp and new. He puffed out his chest, asserting his physical dominance. "Yeah? And how would you know that? Did you feel the engine's vibrations with your magic wrinkly hands?" Jones chimed in, pointing directly at Arthur's hands. "Seriously, man, you should get those looked at. My grandpa had hands like that. Arthritis. Couldn't even open a jar of pickles by the end. Probably can't even hold a wrench steady," Davis added, completing the circle of mockery. "It's a miracle you haven't broken anything. Maybe you should stick to knitting." The small crowd of onlookers grew. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken tension. It was one thing to joke around, but this was becoming a deliberate, sustained humiliation. The young soldiers were feeding off the attention, their cruelty escalating with each unanswered jibe. They saw Arthur's silence not as dignity but as weakness. They saw his age not as a source of wisdom but as a mark of obsolescence. "Look," Miller said, dropping the pretense of humor and adopting a tone of stern authority he felt his uniform afforded him. "I don't know who approved your contract, but you're a liability. We have standards here. Our equipment needs to be serviced by professionals, not by some hobbyist from a retirement home. I want to see your credentials." Now, Arthur didn't move. He simply held Miller's aggressive gaze. His calm was a stark contrast to the private's red-faced agitation. He said nothing, offering no defense, no explanation. This, more than anything, seemed to enrage Miller. It was as if Arthur was refusing to participate in the drama, denying him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Are you deaf?" Miller snapped. "Credentials. Base authorization. Let's see it." Slowly, as if his joints ached, Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his worn olive-drab jacket. It was an old field jacket, the kind that hadn't been standard issue for 40 years, faded from countless washings and long hours in the sun. Miller's eyes narrowed, a look of triumph on his face. He expected to find some flimsy, expired ID, further proof that this old man didn't belong. As Arthur fumbled inside the jacket, Miller's gaze drifted across the worn fabric. He noticed a small object pinned to the lapel, nearly lost in a frayed seam. It was a small, faded blue ribbon, dotted with tiny white stars, hanging from a tarnished metal bar. "What's this supposed to be?" Miller sneered, reaching out and flicking the object with his finger. "You win a prize at the county fair for best preserved relic." The moment Miller's finger touched the metal, the world inside Arthur's head shifted. The smell of grease and diesel fuel vanished, replaced instantly by the acrid metallic stench of cordite and hot gun barrels. The clatter of wrenches faded, overwhelmed by the deafening rhythmic roar of heavy machine gun fire and the high-pitched whine of incoming rounds. The concrete floor of the motor pool dissolved beneath his feet, becoming the cold, muddy earth of a lonely, shell-pocked hill. He felt the phantom weight of a man on his shoulders, the warm, sticky wetness of blood seeping through his uniform. He saw the faces of scared young men, their eyes wide in the gloom of a fighting position, looking to him, a corporal barely out of his teens, for an answer he didn't have. Another image flashed, sharp and clear, a makeshift field hospital, the overwhelming smell of antiseptic and death, a general with tired eyes and a kind face pressing this very metal into his palm. The metal felt impossibly heavy. "The nation is in your debt, son," the general had said, his voice thick with emotion. The echo of the past vanished as quickly as it came. Arthur was back in the motor pool, the sneering face of Private Miller just inches from his own. The world snapped back into focus. The sounds of the bass returned, but the memory lingered, a silent testament to the true nature of the hands Miller had mocked, and the true cost of the trinket he'd just dismissed. From the motor pool office window, Sarah Jenkins had seen enough. A civilian administrator in her late 40s, she'd managed the work orders and personnel files for this section for over a decade. She knew Arthur Peterson well. She knew he arrived 30 minutes before his shift started and left long after it ended. She knew he often fixed tools on his own time, never asking for compensation. She knew he spoke little, but that his word was bond, and she knew that the 3 privates currently tormenting him represented a brand of arrogance that she simply could not abide. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her desk. Her first instinct was to storm out there and give those boys a piece of her mind, but she knew that would only escalate the situation and perhaps embarrass Arthur further. They wouldn't listen to a civilian clerk. They needed to hear from someone they couldn't dismiss. Her eyes fell on the phone. She took a deep, steadying breath, her anger solidifying into a cold, clear purpose. She didn't dial the number for the military police or the motor pool sergeant. She bypassed the entire local chain of command. She had a different number, one she'd only ever used for the most dire administrative emergencies. She dialed. The phone on the other end was picked up with crisp efficiency. "Office of the Commanding General. This is Captain Hayes." "Captain," Sarah began, her voice low but firm, trembling slightly with controlled fury. "This is Sarah Jenkins from the base motor pool. I apologize for the direct call, but I have an urgent situation here that I believe General Wallace will want to know about immediately." There was a skeptical pause on the other end. "The General is in a priority briefing, Miss Jenkins. Can this wait?" "No, Captain, it cannot," Sarah insisted. "It involves a civilian contractor. He's being harassed publicly by several soldiers." "Harassment of a civilian is a serious matter, but the MPs can handle that," the captain said, his tone still dismissive. "Normally, yes," Sarah said, closing her eyes and picturing Arthur's quiet, dignified face. "But the civilian in question is Mr. Arthur Peterson." She let the name hang in the air. "I'm sorry, could you spell that name for me?" "Peterson. Arthur Peterson." She heard the faint sound of typing, then a sharp, indrawn breath on the other end of the line. The captain's entire tone changed. The bureaucratic drone vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp alarm. "Mr. Peterson is at the motor pool, right now?" "Yes, Captain, and he's being accused of being a hazard and a fraud by a Private Miller and his friends. They're mocking him. They're trying to remove him from the premises." "Stay right where you are, Miss Jenkins." The captain's voice was now clipped and urgent. "Do not intervene. The general is on his way." The line went dead. Sarah hung up the phone, her heart pounding. She looked out the window. The cavalry, it seemed, was on its way. Inside the heavily soundproofed conference room at the heart of the base's command center, General Wallace, a man whose 2 stars were earned through decades of decisive action, was listening to a tedious logistics report. His face was a study in bored patience. His aide, Captain Hayes, slipped into the room, moving with a quiet urgency that immediately drew the general's attention. The captain leaned down and whispered into his ear. General Wallace waved him off with an annoyed flick of his wrist. "Not now, Captain." "Sir," Hayes whispered again, his voice tight. "It's about Arthur Peterson." The general froze. The name cut through the drone of the briefing like a rifle shot. His head snapped toward his aide, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What did you say?" "Arthur Peterson, sir. He's on this base, in the motor pool, and he is being disrespected." The transformation in General Wallace was instantaneous and terrifying to behold. The bored patience evaporated, replaced by a cold fire. He shot to his feet, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The entire room fell silent, the logistics officer trailing off mid-sentence. Every eye was on the general. "Peterson, Arthur Peterson is here." The general's voice was a low growl. He looked around the room at his staff, men who had known him for years and had never seen this expression on his face. "Gentlemen, this briefing is over," Something of monumental importance has just come to my attention." He turned and strode toward the door, not waiting for a response. "Captain," he barked over his shoulder, "get my vehicle and a full MP escort. Tell them to break every speed limit on this base. Now." The officers left in the conference room exchanged stunned, confused glances. Who on earth was Arthur Peterson? Back in the motor pool, Miller's patience had finally snapped. Arthur's stoic silence had become an infuriating challenge to his authority. He felt his own credibility was on the line now, in front of the watching crowd. He had to make the old man submit. "That's it," Miller declared, his voice high and strained. "You're done here. You're a trespasser on a military installation, and you are a danger to this equipment." He took a step forward, and in a shocking breach of conduct, grabbed Arthur's upper arm. The fabric of the old jacket bunched in his fist. "I'm taking you to the Provost Marshal's office myself. Maybe a night in the stockade will teach you some respect for this uniform." It was the ultimate overreach, the final, unforgivable act. He was putting his hands on the old man, trying to physically drag him away. Arthur didn't fight back. He didn't struggle. He simply let his arm go limp in Miller's grasp. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Not anger, not fear, but a deep, profound sadness. It was the look of a man who had seen the very worst of humanity and was disappointed but not surprised to see its petty echoes here, in a place of peace. It was at that exact moment that the sound arrived. A high, piercing siren, not the familiar whoop-whoop of a base patrol car, but the urgent, continuous wail of a command escort. Heads turned, tires screeched on the pavement just outside the motor pool's wide bay doors. A gleaming black staff car, flags mounted on its front fenders, fishtailed to a halt. It was flanked by two heavily armed MP Humvees, their lights flashing, casting strobing reds and blues across the stunned faces of the onlookers. The doors of the staff car were thrown open before it had fully stopped. General Wallace emerged like a thunderclap. His uniform was immaculate, his 2 stars glittered on his collar, but his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was followed by Captain Hayes and 4 stone-faced military policemen who fanned out, their presence alone a crushing weight of authority. The entire motor pool was frozen in a state of collective shock. Soldiers and civilians alike snapped to attention, their backs ramrod straight, all except for Private Miller, who was still holding Arthur Peterson's arm, his mouth hanging open in a silent O of disbelief. His mind struggled to process what was happening. Why was the base commanding general here? Why the full escort? General Wallace's eyes scanned the scene, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces until it landed on Miller, his hand still clamped on Arthur's jacket. The general's eyes narrowed to slits, but he didn't speak to Miller. He didn't even acknowledge his existence. He strode forward with a purpose that seemed to part the air in front of him, his polished boots clicking on the concrete floor. He walked directly to Arthur. He stopped 2 feet away from the old mechanic. He ignored Miller, who hastily snatched his hand back from Arthur's arm as if he'd been burned. The general's gaze traveled from Arthur's grease-stained boots, up the faded jacket, over the tired, calm face, and finally came to rest on the small, unassuming medal pinned to the lapel. The fury on the general's face dissolved. It melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. In the dead, echoing silence of the motor pool, General Wallace's body snapped to the rigid, perfect posture of attention. He raised his right hand, swift and sharp, and delivered the most profound salute of his long and decorated career. The sound of his palm connecting with the brim of his cover was like a crack of thunder. Miss Peterson," General Wallace's voice boomed, thick with an emotion no one present had ever heard from him. "It is an absolute honor to have you on my base, sir." He held the salute, his eyes locked on Arthur's. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Every person in that motor pool held their breath. Miller and his friends looked as if they might faint. Slowly, with the weariness of ages, Arthur Peterson gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. General Wallace lowered his hand, but he did not relax his posture. He turned to address the stunned assembly, but his words were directed at the 3 terrified privates who now seemed to be shrinking into themselves. "Do you know who this is?" The general's voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the large space. He didn't wait for an answer. "This is Arthur Peterson." In the spring of 1969, during a counter-offensive in the Ashau Valley, then Corporal Peterson's platoon was cut off and ambushed on Hill 256. Their lieutenant was killed in the first volley. Their sergeants were wounded. For 2 days and 2 nights, Corporal Peterson, with a malfunctioning radio and a dwindling supply of ammunition, single-handedly held the northern flank of their position against repeated enemy assaults. The general took a step closer to Arthur, his voice rising with passion. With his own 2 hands, the same hands you boys found so amusing, He repaired a jammed machine gun under heavy fire. He low-crawled through mud and razor wire to retrieve ammunition from the fallen. He carried 7 wounded men, one by one, to the relative safety of a crater, and then returned to his post. He held that line. When reinforcements finally broke through, they found him unconscious from blood loss, surrounded by the evidence of his impossible stand. He was the only one left fighting. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The story was the stuff of legends, the kind of tale they heard in basic training to inspire them. But here was the legend, in the flesh, a quiet old man who fixed their trucks. For his actions, General Wallace continued, his eyes now boring into Miller. For his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Corporal Arthur Peterson was awarded this nation's highest decoration for valor. The general gently tapped the faded blue ribbon on Arthur's jacket. The Medal of Honor. The name of the medal fell into the silence with the force of a physical blow. Miller, Jones, and Davis visibly paled, their faces a mixture of horror and dawning gut-wrenching shame. They hadn't just insulted an old mechanic, they had mocked a living icon, a man whose courage dwarfed anything they could ever imagine. The crowd of onlookers was now staring at Arthur with a mixture of awe and deep respect. The quiet old man had been transformed before their very eyes into a giant. Finally, General Wallace turned his full, undivided attention to the 3 privates. The fire was back in his eyes, but it was a cold, deliberate flame now. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet intensity of his words was more devastating than any shout could ever be. Private Miller, Private Jones, Private Davis, he said, the names dropping like stones. You are a disgrace, not just to the uniform you wear, but to the very idea of what that uniform is supposed to represent. You stand in the presence of a man who defines the words valor and sacrifice, and you saw nothing but a target for your cheap, pathetic jokes. You looked at a hero and saw only an old man. You looked at his scars and saw only weakness. Your failure today is not one of discipline but of character. It is a failure of spirit. He let the words hang in the air. Your time as combat arms soldiers is over. Your NCOs will be informed that you are to be reassigned. Your new duties will involve mops, brooms, and a great deal of time for quiet contemplation on the subjects of humility and respect. You will learn. He then turned back to Arthur, his expression softening once more. Mr. Peterson, sir, on behalf of every soldier on this post, I offer my deepest, most sincere apology. Please, tell me what we can do to make this right. All eyes fell on Arthur. He looked at the general, then at the 3 young men, who were now trembling, their faces ashen with shame. He looked down at his own gnarled, scarred hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. They're just kids, General, Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. They're young, full of fire. They haven't seen enough yet to know what to look for. He lifted his gaze to meet Miller's terrified eyes. They see an old man, not what the old man has seen. Maybe they just need to learn to look closer. As Arthur spoke those words, a final brief image bloomed in his memory. He was young again, barely 20, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages. He stood in a dusty tent as a general, a different general from a different war, pinned the Medal of Honor to his dirty field jacket. The general's grip was firm on his shoulder. Son, the old general had said, his voice thick with the gravity of the moment, never be ashamed of what you've been through. These scars, on your body and on your soul, are not a sign of weakness. They are a map of your courage. Don't ever forget what these hands have done. A few weeks passed. The incident at the motor pool became a quiet, cautionary legend on the base. True to his word, General Wallace instituted a new mandatory block of instruction for all newly arrived personnel. It was a history lesson, not of famous battles but of the quiet heroes who had served at this very installation, a program designed to teach humility and to remind every soldier that respect was not dictated by rank or age but by character. Privates Miller, Jones, and Davis were not seen in the motor pool again. They were reassigned to the base's sanitation detail, under the watchful eye of a master sergeant who believed that humility was best taught through hard labor and meticulous attention to detail. One sweltering afternoon, Miller was on his hands and knees, scrubbing a stubborn patch of oil from the concrete floor of a vehicle bay. It was grueling, thankless work. He heard footsteps and looked up to see Arthur Peterson walking past, his old metal lunchbox in his hand, on his way home for the day. Miller flinched, expecting a glare, a word of scorn, or worst of all, pity. He braced himself and looked back down at the floor, his face burning with shame. But the footsteps stopped. He felt a shadow fall over him. He looked up again. Arthur was standing there, looking down at him not with anger but with something unreadable in his pale blue eyes. Arthur bent down slowly, the joints in his back creaking, and set a cold bottle of water on the floor beside Miller. "It's a hot day," Arthur said, his voice the same quiet rumble as always. "Stay hydrated, son." Without another word, Arthur straightened up and continued on his way, his silhouette framed for a moment in the golden light of the setting sun before he disappeared from view. Miller stared at the bottle of water, a single drop of condensation tracing a path down its side like a tear. He felt a lump form in his throat. In that one small, simple gesture of kindness, Arthur had given him not the condemnation he deserved, but the grace he so desperately needed. The lesson was learned. Arthur Peterson's story reminds us that heroes are all around us, often in the most unassuming forms. If you were moved by his story of courage and humility, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories that deserve to be told.